Okay, so I'm happy to be here today. Today I'm going to talk about two notable African-American women who have recently been recognized by the Erie Center for Arts and Technology, ECAT. ECAT is dedicated to inspiring education and empowering adults and at-risk youth. Since its opening, ECAT has the opportunity to recognize two amazing women, one with a mural and one with a community room. The mural that faces 6th Street honors Carla Hughes, who died last year at the age of 50. Carla was a beloved teacher who taught dance at the Northwest Pennsylvania Collegiate Academy through her entire 17-year career with the Erie School District. She was a well-known Erie Playhouse performer and a member of the Playhouse's board of directors. Throughout the years, she remained active in the Erie community. She worked with Life Through Music and created a segment called Life Through Dance. She was also involved with Erie Arts and Culture. She was currently serving as president of the Erie Dance Consortium. Carla attended Wayne School as a youth and later became a teacher, making her a perfect choice for the dynamic mural that adorns the building, which you can see in the center of the slide. The ECAT Community Room will be dedicated tomorrow in honor of Aydah Lawrence. Next slide, please. Aydah Lawrence died in 2014 at the age of 93. Aydah had a long and notable life in Erie. In 1946, 26-year-old Aydah Lawrence was the first full-time black teacher hired in the 20th century by the Erie School District. Significantly, Lawrence was hired 8 years before the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation was unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. Lawrence grew up in Erie, graduated from Strong Vincent High School in 1939, and then graduated from Cheney State Teachers College in 1943. Later, she earned a master's degree in guidance and counseling from Gannon University. After teaching for a brief time at a segregated school in Maryland, she returned to Erie and was hired in 1946 by the Erie School District. Lawrence started her teaching career in Erie at McKinley Elementary School. In an interview in 2008 with the Erie Times-News, Lawrence described how she felt on her first day teaching in Erie. Quote, "I was thinking, gee, I've got some work to do," laughs. "I guess I thought to myself, gee, it really happened. I'm going to be a teacher," unquote. She taught for 36 years. Lawrence also mentored younger black teachers such as Johnny Johnson and Celestine Davis and passed on her knowledge and passion for Erie Black history. Lawrence also served on the board of the Dr. Gertrude Barber Center, helped establish the Martin Luther King Center, and served many years with the Erie chapter of the NAACP and the Harriet T. Burley Society. Aydah Lawrence passed away in 2014 after a life of service to her community. I invite all of you to join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. at ECAT for the community room dedication. It's an honor for me to be associated with ECAT and these two remarkable women, and a pleasure for me to be here today to bring you their stories. Thank you.
In 1992, a group of Unitarian Universalists gathered at a seminary in Collingdale, Pennsylvania. They were there at Mount Eden Cemetery, one of the oldest black cemeteries in the nation, to restore the gravestone of one of their own spiritual ancestors, which had fallen into disrepair. That Unitarian ancestor was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and I'd like to ask that the slide with her portrait be shown at this time. There she is. This is our spiritual ancestor, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Thank you, Clyde. She died in 1911. And today I would like to ask all of us here in 2021, why? Why that gravestone had fallen into disrepair. Why many of us had never heard the name of this woman. This woman who stood on a stage with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and articulated a vision of a more inclusive feminism. A woman whose writing was nationally famous, including a best-selling novel, one of the first to be published by a Black woman. A woman whose gifts as a speaker were counted to be on a level with Frederick Douglass, and some critics gave her the higher ratings. A woman whose poetry touched hearts and minds with its imaginative and yet wrenching portrayals of enslaved human beings in our own country, but who wrote of so many other topics as well. Why was this brilliant thinker, writer, speaker, teacher, justice leader largely forgotten until 1992, when her legacy began to be slowly rehabilitated and recovered? I ask these questions not just for Frances's sake alone. I ask them also for us, her spiritual descendants, the ones that come after. For if we do not know the stories of our ancestors, or if we know only a flattened, narrowed, lopsided version of those stories, isn't it true that we cannot really know who we are? As Frances said and wrote, we are all bound up together. She wrote these words, cast that vision of interdependence long before Martin Luther King Jr.'s words of a single garment of destiny, a network of mutuality, long before co-liberation theory, and over 100 years before our own seventh principle about the interdependent web of existence. Now, there is a bit of a paradox that I want to name about setting aside dedicated times to talk about certain subjects. There's a paradox, isn't there? I'm talking about Black History Month, Women's History Month, and other places in the year where we decide to honor marginalized or oppressed peoples. It's certainly, absolutely, vitally important to tell these stories, and they're not heard often enough. But by relegating them to a separate sphere, by putting them in a little box, we may begin to think of them as separate subjects from history. They are not. In reality, we are all bound up together. Black history is American history. Women's history is American history. And so today, to honor Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, I begin to tell a few of the hundreds of stories that could be told about her amazing life. Let us continue to tell those stories at many times of the year and on many occasions, because Black history is American history. Women's history is American history. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper lived right around this part of the country, actually. She was born a free Black woman in Baltimore in 1825, but she spent most of her adult life in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know for sure if she ever traveled to or through Erie, but it's certainly a good possibility. She lived for a time in Wilberforce, Ohio, and she also spent time teaching in York, Pennsylvania. But she lived most of her years in the city of Philadelphia. Now, Frances had many struggles in her long life. Her husband died young, and she spent a good number of years as a single mother, struggling to survive and raise her children. She was born a Black female child into a nation that practiced cruel enslavement of people of color, and in which women were also seen as less than and denied certain rights of property, education, enfranchisement, and body autonomy, among others. And yet, Frances also acknowledged that in some ways she had led a privileged life. She had access to a good education from an early age. She was born free at a time when most Black people in our country were being enslaved. In her most famous novel, Aydah Lawrence, the protagonist, a Black woman whose skin is very light, decides that she wants to live as a Black woman and forego the opportunity to pass as a white person. This character in the novel does this out of a sense of solidarity and duty to use her privileged social location to help her people. In a similar way, I see Frances Ellen Watkins Harper as a person who used the privileges that she had acquired to help those who were less fortunate than her, to be in solidarity with people who were struggling, and to speak out for the rights of those whose rights were being denied. She called for more and greater equality in our nation. She called out hypocrisy in justice movements that were not fully inclusive. She brought the horrors of enslavement into the human heart and mind with her popular fiction and her poetry. Throughout her life, Frances maintained a connection and identification both with the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the Unitarian Church. And she identified more as Unitarian in her theology and in her vision of justice and inclusion for women. But African Methodist Episcopal Church was the kind of her spiritual home base. It was the tradition of her birth and of her family. So she was someone who went between those two worlds and felt connected to both of them throughout her life. Now, in researching her life and her work, I have been struck by the visionary nature of her mind so many times, and I wish I could share all the things with you that I learned about her, all the writings that just blew me away. But since we don't have enough time, I will just share a few examples of her work that I think are really, that really illustrate her genius and the breathtaking range of her thoughtful writing. In her poetry, she often wrote vignettes about people who were enslaved and some of the painful situations that they were in. One of them was called The Slave Mother. And in this little short stanza that's a part of that poem, she not only captures the fear of a woman who is afraid to be separated from her child, that may be sold to a different family while they are on the auction block together. But she also does something very, very interesting with the ideas of light and darkness. And I've seen this in a number of her poems where at that time, in the era that she lived in, light was considered to be of God and was a metaphor for heaven and all things good, and darkness was a metaphor for things that were bad and things that were of the other place. And And she really played with these ideas of lightness and darkness and paleness and darkness. So in this little short stanza that I'll read you, she uses the idea of being pale as a metaphor for fear and for something that is very unpleasant rather than something that is good and from heaven. She says, "She is a mother pale with fear. Her boy clings to her side, and in her kirtle vainly tries his trembling form to hide." She's trying to hide her child inside her garment so that he won't be seen and sold away from her. Just in that brief vignette, so much is captured, so much pain. I want to read you another little vignette from another poem called Bible Defense of Slavery, where Frances calls out the hypocrisy of those who use Bible verses to defend the enslavement of human beings. And once again, you'll see her playing with the images of light, paleness, and darkness, and kind of subverting them in her own way. She says, "Let holy horror blanch each cheek, pale every brow with fears, and rocks and stones, if ye could speak, ye might well melt to tears." And she's talking about having the Bible used to defend the practice of slavery. Now, Frances was an incredibly well-rounded Renaissance person, and she had poetry and writings on so many different subjects. She also wrote a very forward-thinking feminist, we might say proto-feminist poem that was called Double Standard. And it was about the judgment of women for being sexual people, for engaging in sexual activity, where the same men that were involved with them, perhaps in a liaison or a relationship, were never judged by the same standard. So you can listen to her words about that. "Would you blame the world if it should press on him a civic crown and see me struggling in the depth, then hardly press me down? Crime has no sex, and yet today I wear the brand of shame, whilst he, amidst the gay and proud, still bears an honored name. Can you blame me if I've learned to think your hate of vice a sham, when you so coldly crushed me down and then excused the man?" She really gets at some real truths here, right? Truths that we are still struggling with in our society today. Elsewhere, Frances speaks of the double bind that Black women experience, the double bind of racism and sexism. And in naming that, she foreshadows and prefigures the intersectionality discussions that we have in our own time about how interlocking privileges or interlocking oppressions can multiply the person's experience of difficulty and struggle. Now, perhaps Frances's most renowned speech was the one that she gave on that dais beside Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in 1866, the year after the end of the Civil War. This speech came to be titled, "We Are All Bound Up Together," and that is indeed the title of our service today. Now, in it, Frances spoke of a moral interdependence, of the consequences to white people when they permitted a horrific racist system to enslave their fellow human beings. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in doing so, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the Black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and the freedom of the press. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members. In the South, the legislation of the country was in behalf of the rich slaveholders, while the poor white man was neglected. Now there, she names divisions that are still plaguing us and ways that politicians are still manipulating our society today. Now she goes on to doubt that giving white women the vote will actually fix all the ills of the nation, as the suffragettes had been claiming would happen if women could vote. She said this in response: "You white women speak of rights, I speak of wrongs." She goes on to doubt that white women are the moral paragons, or as she expresses it, dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I love her language. She doubts that the fine sentiments and the high-flown words of the white suffragists will result in the end of Black suffering or real liberation for Black people. We are still living with some of those divisions that she has described here in this speech. We still live with the division between rich white people, privileged white people, and poor white people who are being manipulated sometimes to vote against their own interests, between white women and Black women in the struggles of the feminist movement, because it was not designed to be inclusive, because it was not encompassing all women. It was focusing on white women's needs and white women's interests. She calls out later in the speech the moral hypocrisy of the United States government. She says, "In advocating the cause of the colored man since the Dred Scott decision, I have sometimes said that I thought the nation had touched bottom. But let me tell you, there is a depth of infamy lower than that. It is when this nation, standing on the threshold of a great peril," which she meant the Civil War, "reached out its hands to a feebler race and asked that race to help it. And when the peril was over, said, 'Well, you are good enough for soldiers, but not good enough for citizens.'" Finally, she describes the strange paradox that she, a speaker on a national stage, a woman of some fame and renown, would not be able to ride public transportation in her own city of Philadelphia. She tells a story of Harriet Tubman. We can presume it was Harriet Tubman. She does not name this hero that is identified as Moses. Honored as a national hero, saved many people from enslavement, and yet was assaulted by a conductor on a train in a brutal encounter, an attempt to throw her off the train that bloodied and swelled her hands. So here, by telling this story, Frances prefigures those famous bus boycotts and the struggle many, many, many decades later for justice that came after in the South. She ends on a harsh note. "Where there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and their selfishness, it is white women." And those are the final words of her speech. I can only imagine what it was like in that moment for her to say that to a gathering of suffragettes with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton standing on each side of her. What courage this woman had. What moral courage. In all, this powerful speech took less time than the sermon I'm sharing with you now, yet she spoke from that deep moral outrage, calling out and calling in these public figures whose words did not match their deeds. Now, it's so hard to capture the essence of anyone's life in a short 15 minutes. And I've told you just a tiny bit about Frances today. It's just really the tip of the iceberg of all the things that she did and said and thought. And I hope that we will continue getting to know her, speaking about her, communing with her legacy throughout the year. And I hope that knowing her a little better will help all of us to tell fuller, truer, richer stories of our heritage as UUs. And I hope, though, that we'll also reflect on what she was telling us, what she was saying to everyone. These beautiful words and good intentions, those cannot take the place of actions. The complexity of human societies means that we must always be working toward justice for all. We must always be working to widen the circle. That we must not be blind. We must not be blind to our own hypocrisy and the ways that we fall short of our own ideals. We must be willing to explore those difficult topics, and we can do it together here in this beautiful community. That whenever any of us are unfree, all of us are harmed, for we are all bound up together. Now, I want the last words today to be Frances's, not mine. And so, to close, I would like to read a complete poem of hers. It's entitled Songs for the People. And I want to dedicate this reading today to the people of Ukraine. Let me make songs for the people, songs for the old and the young, songs to stir like a battle cry whenever they are sung. Not for the clashing of sabers, for carnage nor for strife, but songs to thrill the hearts of men with more abundant life. Let me make songs for the weary amid life's fever and fret, till hearts shall relax their tension and careworn brows forget. Let me sing for little children before their footsteps stray, sweet anthems of love and duty to float over life's highway. I would sing for the poor and the aged when shadows dim their sight, of the bright and restful mansions where there shall be no night. Our world, so worn and weary, needs music pure and strong to hush the jangle and discords of sorrow, pain, and wrong. Music to soothe all its sorrow till war and crime shall cease, and the hearts of men grown tender girdle the world with peace. May it be so.